All
Yes.
right, friends. We are going to jump in to Revelation. This is the body of our study. We did a summary kind of overview session last week. For anyone who missed it, is on YouTube. I sent the link out to everyone who's registered for this class. Go back and watch it if you want to. We'll hit a few of the things again today, but for the most part, we're going to try to move on to new ground and new territory. It's so good to see all your faces. I hope you're enjoying this so far. Here's my word of caution. I've been humbled this week. Writing the email for chapters 1 through 4 was fairly easy. Tonight's content is great. I have no qualms about it. I feel like I understand it all. I'm excited. Past chapter 5 and 6, I'm starting to get a little nervous. So if you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm overwhelmed and out of my depth, join the club. We all are. We got a lot of work to do before we get to that email. Me, Elizabeth, and Hannah had an hour and a half discussion today just about chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. So if you are feeling just, confused, you're in great company. I just want to give you that affirmation. Nothing to be worried about. Um, Here's where I want to start us today. Courtesy of Walt. Walt brought this up in his Revelation class, and I loved it. I just want to set our frame of reference so that when we get to the 7 churches, we understand a little bit about the culture of what's going on in the Roman Empire in this time as a whole. So there is a Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of part of the Roman Empire during this time. Persecution is ramping up, but Rome has a problem. All of the worship that is happening in Roman temples and markets that sell meat from the worship ceremonies, business is running dry. And so all of a sudden, the Roman Empire has to do something. They have a problem that they have to solve because it's affecting not just the worship of the gods, and we don't want to make them angry, right? It's affecting actually the economy of Rome. And so Pliny is going to write to the Emperor Trajan at that time. And here's what he's going to talk about. He's basically asking for him to give him advice for what to do with these troublesome Christians. He's never dealt with it before. He's got an idea of how to act, how to punish them, right? For not worshiping the gods, for not worshiping the goddess of Rome. But he really wants to get some advice on how to go about, bringing judgment and justice on these Christians. And here's what he says in this letter that he writes to Emperor Trajan. This is Pliny speaking. He goes, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I've observed the following procedure. Here's how I'm handling this situation. I interrogate them, ask them whether or not they're Christians. And then those who confess, I ask a second time and a third time, each time threatening them with punishment. And only to those who just persist after that third time do we actually send to the chopping block. Those people I'm going to execute. For I have no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserve to be punished. They're not worshiping you, Emperor. We've got to get rid of these people. Do you see kind of the problem that's at stake here? So he's saying, this is what I've been doing. And by the way, it's working. It's working. All of a sudden, he says, it's possible to cure Christianity because right now, after I've been doing this procedure, killing the Christians who aren't willing to bow down, the temples are filling back up. They were deserted before, but now they're begun to be frequented. The religious rites are coming back, and we're seeing participation happen and pick up in the empire. Do you see what's going on? There are Christians who profess to be Christians, and once they're questioned by this Pliny the Elder, they're either giving in or being executed. And now all of a sudden, the animal sacrifices are flowing, the religious rites are back up again. Christians are giving in. This is kind of the stage that's being set. Some Christians aren't giving in, they're being executed, but some are, and the Roman way of life is returned to normal. So there's a level of just giving in that we have to keep in our mind here. Christians are facing a very real choice: bow down to the emperor, worship the gods, or be killed. And you better believe that some of them are choosing to bow down. Trajan writes back to Pliny, this governor, and he says basically, good boy, you're doing exactly the right thing. Whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it by worshiping the gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. So think about that. If you faced death, would you be willing to give in? That's the question that these Christians that we're going to look at today are wrestling with on a very real basis. This is the question that John's book of Revelation is really going to be addressing. Christians are giving in, and he is going to call them not to do that. Make sense? It's just a little groundwork we're setting before we actually dive in. So, with that in mind, being why the book of Revelation is really even written in the first place, let's dive into the first couple of verses. In the prologue, we're not going to read it word for word because we frankly don't have time. Here's what I want you to notice. We're told two things: that this is a revelation. Remember, that's that word apocalypse, from which we get the type of literature this is, the three types of literature: revelation, prophecy, and it's a circular letter. Apocalypse is the very first word. It's not just an apocalypse meaning end of the world. It's an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. For those of you who weren't with us last week, that just means an unveiling. John is writing to unveil the truth of who Jesus is and how the world is supposed to be. That's all that means. In verse 3, we get the first of what's going to be 7 benedictions or dedications. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, this book, and blessed are those who hear. This is evidence that this whole book was meant to be read aloud within the context of worship. And that's going to be really important when we get into next week. John's going to greet these 7 churches. This is a stereotypical kind of format of an epistle letter. And look right here in verse 4. This is interesting. Grace to you and peace from him who is and him who was. Who's that? That's God, right? From the 7th Spirit and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. What do you see in this first little paragraph here? What do you notice?
Trinity.
It's the Trinity.
The Trinity.
Just a reminder, y'all, make sure you're on mute if you're not answering questions. But I do want you to come off mute and answer my questions. They're not always rhetorical. So right here, we automatically see that John's book of Revelation is Trinitarian in nature. He's going to spend a majority of his time talking about God and Jesus, but the spirits are in here, and we're going to see them pop up a lot. In fact, this phrase, the 7 spirits, is going to occur 7 times in the book of Revelation. The 7 spirits occurs 7 times. The spirit as a whole is going to be talked about 24 times. Here's your math for the day. 7 times 4 is 24. So what is he trying to say?
Is that going to be the only time?
7 times 4 is 28.
Yeah.
Oh, well, is it 7 times 4? Then it's 28 times. You see, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Thank y'all. 7 times 4, 28 times the spirit is going to be talked about. 4 is the number of the world. 7 is the number of completion. And all that means is that it's the perfect, complete working of God's spirit in the world. That's what we're meant to take from that, 28 times. Right here, we have another little introduction. I want to see who can catch the reference here. To him who loves us, this is Jesus. He's talking about Jesus. To him who loves us, has freed us from our sins by his blood, and made us a kingdom priest.
I don't know how this thing doesn't. There's no volume.
Father. Where does this language, does this sound familiar to you? Kingdom of priests?
Can you
Does it sound familiar?
Yeah.
That's what Israel is supposed to be.
Israel,
Right.
yeah. Nation
Remember,
of priests.
that's exactly right. Exodus 19, coming right back here. We're going to see that over and over again today. God tells the people at Mount Sinai, I will make you a kingdom of priests, my treasured possession for the whole world. That's their purpose. And here, John is saying, this is us. This is our goal. This is what we're doing. He says, behold, he is coming with the clouds.
I don't know how to get this volume on.
Duke, I'm going to keep muting you. I'm so sorry. He says, behold, he is coming with the clouds. This right here is a direct reference to Daniel 7. And Daniel 7 is going to be all over Revelation, particularly for this week's reading and when we get into chapter 5. Just listen to this. The Ancient of Days took his seat. By the way, this is apocalyptic literature itself. His clothing was white as snow, hair of his head like pure wool. Remember these two images. His throne was fiery flames, wheels, burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Then we get this prophecy about the Son of Man. Behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Why is he pulling in this reference? What does Son of Man even mean? What does it have to do? Because the Son of Man is the one to whom is going to be given a kingdom that lasts forever. Do you remember talking about this in Daniel? When we talked about Daniel, all people, nations, and languages are going to serve him. His kingdom shall not be destroyed. All of these images are being looped into this one phrase, the Son of Man coming with the clouds. Then look at this line, even those who pierced him. You want to know where that's coming from? Zechariah 2. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace, pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child and weep bitterly over him. I'm going to show you these two references, even though we're not going to be able to show you every reference, because I want you to remember the two things we talked about last week. Instead of holding the newspaper in our hand when we read Revelation, we have to hold the Old Testament in our hand.
Girls,
because it's going to
put your gowns on.
Has a reference back to.
After this one, we're going to bed.
Sorry, Bev. I'm going to mute you there. Every line in Revelation links back to some Old Testament story. Remember, sometimes as many as 7. Right here, we have at least 2. You could argue for more with all tribes of the earth, going back to that Exodus 19 passage. So we're not going to show you every link, every reference, but I want you to keep in mind how John is writing with the Hebrew Bible in mind. The other thing we have to keep in our hand, right? Hebrew Bible, as we're reading Revelation, culture and context. And that's really going to come into play when we get into the letters. Here, this is the Lord God speaking. He's going to give us a title, the divine title. I am the Alpha and the Omega, who was and is to come, the Almighty. Now, here's something pretty cool that Michael Gorman, no, it was Richard Bauckham actually pointed this out.
I don't know.
7 times there is going to be an occurrence of the divine title. Here's what I mean by that. So right here in 1:8, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. If you know your Greek alphabet, Alpha is the first letter. Omega is the last.
Yeah.
Okay. So then in Revelation 1:17, which we'll read here in just a minute, Jesus is going to say, I'm the first and the last. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that those are 2 of the same things. It's a different way of saying the exact same thing, right? Okay. Later, at the end of the book, we're going to get titles several more different ways.
Sorry. Me too. That's just doesn't make you.
Revelation 21:6, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Again, first and last means the same thing. And then finally, in the last chapter of Revelation, Jesus is going to put it all together. I am the Alpha, the Omega, the first and last, the beginning and the end. Do you see what he's doing? 7 times we get this divine title. If all of these mean the same thing, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You see it? All of these mean the same things. What is John trying to get at here? the author of this book. Perfection, completeness is represented by both God and Jesus. They are two sides of the same coin. He's pointing to the divinity of Jesus. And this isn't going to be the last time he does it, but it is one of the most subtle times he does it. All throughout the book, 7 times using the exact same title for both God and Jesus. Make sense? Okay, let's keep going here. John is going to now tell us a little bit about himself. He's going to call himself a brother and partner in the tribulation. Somehow he's in trouble for his faith in Jesus. He is on the island of Patmos, or was at least at one point on the island of Patmos. If you remember, Patmos is going to be right here, this island, right off the coast of where these 7 churches are in Asia Minor. Walt brings up a really cool theory, which I am pretty compelled by. Patmos is not a penal colony. So whatever John is doing on the island of Patmos, he is not in prison. He's just not. There's no way. There's no evidence that that was a jail for people like John. He tells us that he was in exile, and that could be 2 different kinds of exile. The first kinds of exile is someone tells you you have to go, right? The other kind of exile is a self-exile. We know Jesus likes to go into the wilderness. It's a common thing for mystics and followers of Jesus who want to get away from the city to go and be in the wilderness by themselves so they can be with God and experience God. I think that's probably a pretty likely theory, that what John is doing is self-exiling on Patmos to be with God, to get away from the pressure and the persecution he may be experiencing because of his belief in Jesus. Just a reminder, we don't have any full idea who John is. We have theories. He could be the apostle, the disciple of Jesus. He could be a writer evoking that name or that tradition of teaching, or it could just be another follower of Jesus named John. We're not told, and it's not important for you to try and figure that out. He tells us that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, aka the Sabbath, and then something just miraculous happened to him. He hears a loud voice like a trumpet who tells him to write what you see, this vision you're about to have, in a book and send it to 7 churches, the 7 churches we're going to study tonight from Asia Minor. By the way, this wouldn't be book. This is actually scroll because they didn't have books. How they communicated was in scrolls, which will again come into play when we get to chapter 5 next week. So God is the one speaking here. And the reason we know that is because over and over again in the Hebrew Bible, whenever you hear a voice like a trumpet, it is likely talking about God. So Exodus 19, this is when they go to meet God. A very loud trumpet blast sounds, thick cloud on the mountain. What are the people doing there? They're meeting God. They're preparing to meet God. When you hear the trumpet burst, prepare to meet your maker, so to speak. I hope that y'all never hear a trumpet the same way again after that. God is going to tell him to write this down. Then he's going to turn and see something else. Here's that pattern we talked about last week at play. Here's is a voice like a trumpet telling him to write this vision, this message down and send it to these 7 churches. But what does he see? What he sees is 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of them, one like a son of man. Okay, he's going to tell us a lot about this Son of Man. I'm highlighting a couple of details here to parse through.
Thank you.
His voice is like the roar of many waters. This is a link, a callback to the Old Testament, where God's voice over and over again is described as this roar of many waters. He holds 7 stars in his hand. In the Roman world, they would look up at the sky and notice that there seemed to be 7 stars who didn't move, not like the rest of the stars. We now know that those are the 7 planets: Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, and the moon, I think, is one of the other ones that just didn't seem to move like the rest. What the Romans believed is that to hold the 7 stars was a way of saying you controlled the cosmos. You were the one who controlled the direction that the world is headed. So what is John going to do? John says it's not Caesar or the Roman Empire that holds the 7 stars. It's Jesus. Jesus is the one who controls the cosmos, so to speak. He gives him, from his mouth, we're told, comes a 2-edged sword. This is also a pretty Roman image. Remember, we're holding culture in our hands along with the Hebrew Bible. The Roman Empire had a status called Protesti Gladi, which I am probably butchering in pronunciation. Protesti Gladi, for cities who had this status in the Roman Empire, it was like saying that when you spoke and you made decisions as a city, you were speaking with the authority of the emperor. So to have the authority of the double-edged sword is to have the same level of authority as the emperor. Does that make sense? So what is John saying here? Or what is John seeing in this vision? It's who has the one to speak on behalf of the true emperor God? Jesus. Jesus is the one. And then we get this line, his face is like the sun shining in full strength. Can you think of any story in the Bible where someone has a face that's just shining and illuminated?
Transfiguration.
Yes, the transfiguration is absolutely one. But also, we're going to see that same thing happen. It starts actually with Moses. Moses, when he goes up on the mountain, he meets with God, he sees God face to face, and he comes down the mountain and his face shines like the sun because he'd been talking with God. In fact, he has to wear a veil over his face because when the people see him, they're terrified. Moses's shiny face is only temporary. It only happens when he speaks with God and then it kind of wears off. Jesus in the transfiguration, it doesn't wear off. He shines like the sun because he expresses the glory of God. Moses, it's like the glory of God kind of rubs off on him a little bit, but from Jesus, it's like it exudes from within him. Okay, do you see how John is working here? How he's pulling both from culture and the Old Testament scriptures and weaving these things together to provide this kind of message. If you are living in the oppression of the Roman Empire and you're hearing that this person who holds the cosmos in his hand, who has the authority to speak on behalf of God, whose face shines with the glory of God, who's white as snow and his voice is like roaring waters, just like God, you're hearing that that person stands in the midst of all the churches. He's with you. If you're experiencing persecution at the hands of the Roman, what does that message do for you to hear? Jesus is with you. He stands in the midst of you. It's just a comforting expression, right? This is what John is doing.
Yeah, and it's giving you courage.
Yes. If Jesus is with us, then what is anything else? Who can be against us, right? John takes this as a pretty terrifying image. He falls down at the feet of Jesus as though dead. This is the man who he stands in front of. This isn't just like a sweet, picture of Jesus with the sheep who's like cuddling the sheep and looks so nice and friendly. This image of Jesus in his full glory and full strength makes him fall down, like have a heart attack almost. And Jesus says, "Fear not. I am the first and the last." Here's that second instance of the divine title. I'm the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys to death, right? Jesus has just been victorious over death through the resurrection. And then here's the thing I want you to notice. Jesus is going to tell him, write down the things that you have seen. So not only does Jesus say this, write these things down that you're seeing in a book. Who else said that to him?
God.
That's right. Write what you see in a book. So both God and Jesus, again, John is showing them to be equal, the same authority, the same instruction coming from both of them. The instruction, everything you're about to see, you got to write it down because the churches need to hear this. Okay, we ready to move into the letters? How are we doing so far? Have I lost you yet? Hanging in there?
Hanging in.
Okay. I'm trusting you to reach a hand out if you're feeling a little dizzy or confused or foggy, because we're moving fast through these. In an ideal world, that would have been one lecture all in itself, but we got 7 churches to go and potentially chapter 4. And we got 30 minutes. So here we go. For each of the churches, there's a pattern of 3 that I want you to see. There's an introduction. Jesus is going to give most of the churches like a positive word of encouragement. Then he's going to have something against them, some kind of warning or advice or lesson to teach. And then we'll have like kind of a conclusion there at the end. I'm going to give you some cultural context for each of these churches. And then we're going to read them and see how that illuminates the letters themselves. Make sense? Let's start in Ephesus. Ephesus is the 2nd largest city in the Roman Empire. For Emperor Domitian, who was emperor at the time this book is written, this is his essentially capital city. There's a word for it. I can't remember. Go watch the Be Mom podcast. You have Rome, and then you have like each emperor picks like their own little capital city outside of Rome. This was Domitian's. It was a port city. You may recall in Acts that it's famous for its worship of the goddess Artemis. Paul gets himself in a little bit of trouble when he comes to Ephesus. In fact, in the temple of Artemis, there is a tree called the asylum tree. And any criminal who gets within a certain feet of this tree will be granted asylum. Basically, their crimes will be forgiven and they'll be considered safe for the moment. This is a city where emperor worship is at an all-time high. This is one of the cities. All 7, we'll find out, have some kind of emperor worship, cult of the empire. They're worshiping Rome as a whole. Ephesus is where that's turned up a little bit, not as much as others, but it is turned up. And this is the city that's going to receive the most praise from Jesus. So knowing some of those things, let's look at this. What does Jesus know about them? He knows their toil, their works, their patient endurance, how you cannot bear with those that are evil, right? They are holding up strong. They're doing really well. They've been able to recognize the false prophets that are coming from within them. And they're not grown weary for Jesus's name. They're doing really well. So what's the problem? Jesus is going to say, this is what I have against you. You've abandoned the love you had at first. Now, what could that be talking about? Lots of different scholars have posed lots of different options. I really like what Bema has to say about this. If you remember in Acts, what was the whole issue at play? It was whether or not the Jewish Christians were going to accept all the Gentile Christians.
Gentiles.
That's
Yeah.
right. And so this, by the words of encouragement in this letter, it seems like they're doing well with belief. They can recognize false prophets. They're holding on strong. It's likely in that abandoning the love they had at first, that what they're actually struggling with is how to practice the faith. So orthodoxy, faith, the theology, they're doing really well. Orthopraxy, they're struggling with a little. And it's possible that the love they had at first that they're forgetting now, that they're kind of turning their back on, is accepting the Gentiles into the church without making them jump through hoops. You see what I'm saying? The love that Ephesians just went on and on about, what does it mean to love Jew and Gentile and creating this multinational family. I think that's what this is talking about. The Jews have stopped allowing the Gentiles to experience that love in the same way. And Jesus is just going to call them to turn around, do the opposite, to repent. Go back to the way you were doing things at first. If not, you're in danger of losing your church status, essentially. he also says, again, just bookending this, like the Oreo cookie of encouragement. By the way, you're doing a good job of like not listening to the Nicolaitans. Those guys are awful. We'll talk about them here in a little bit. And then Jesus is going to end each letter with kind of a similar refrain. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The Spirit is going to show up 7 times. And this, he who has an ear, let him hear, is going to show up 7 times in each of the letters. Who do we know who says constantly, he who has the ear to hear, let him hear? It's Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah, all throughout the Gospels, one of his favorite sayings. And so again, this is just linking back to the way Jesus always taught. Understand what I'm telling you. Listen to this message that comes from the Spirit, that's to the churches from Jesus. And then again, 7 times we're going to get this refrain, to the one who conquers. What does it mean to conquer? We're going to find out more later on in the book, but for now, you should just know what it means is to be faithful. Let the one who is faithful to the way of Jesus, to that person, I will grant to eat the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. What is he linking to? The tree of asylum. You think that this tree in the middle of Artemis's temple can save you? No, no. The tree of life is the one that can save you. And this is going to be a huge theme when we get to the end of the book. The tree of life is going to show up in a big way in chapters 21 and 22. Feel good about the first church and the structure as a whole? Okay, we're going to move fairly quickly. Stop me when you have questions. Okay, Smyrna. Again, cultural context, and then we'll read and see what illuminates in the letter itself. Smyrna, if Ephesus is like a Roman, cultish kind of place, dial that up to 12 and you get Smyrna. They are devout Roman loyalists. They love the emperor. They love Caesar. This is a place where the imperial cult reigns supreme, where they worship the gods with a fervor and call everyone else to do the same. Smyrna is known for its obsession with death. In fact, it's right in the name. Their main export is myrrh. Do you remember myrrh? The 3 wise men bring Jesus gifts of frankincense and myrrh. Myrrh is a spice used to prepare bodies for burial. Smyrna has an obsession with death and resurrection. And we'll see that come up to play here in a minute. Their main export is myrrh. They're a very wealthy city. And because they're wealthy, they've created their own kind of social caste system. And the way that they delineate between these different castes are with crowns. So if you're the top of the social caste, you have a gold crown. If you're like in the middle class, you have a silver crown, and then a bronze crown, and then like no crown. So they delineate based on colors of different crowns. Smyrna is also a center for medicine and science. They specialize, I believe this is the one that specializes in this eye salve. I might be getting that wrong. It might be another one. But they are known for being a cultural center for science and medicine. Christians here were persecuted way more often. It is really difficult to buy and sell here in Smyrna without worshiping other gods. For example, this is the city. Let me make sure I'm saying this right. Yeah, it's hard to buy and sell if you are non-loyal. They worship the goddess of Roma. Smyrna had been destroyed in 600 BC, and then it was rebuilt. So it kind of came back to life on its own. And there is here a Jewish contingent, purely Jewish, not Jewish Christians, but a Jewish contingent who really despises the Gentiles. It's like angsty level 15. Okay, with all of that in our mind, let's look back at this letter. Jesus is going to introduce them, the words of the first and last, who died and came back to life. Appropriate for Smyrna? Absolutely. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, For Christians who are having trouble even buying or selling in a city known for its wealth, do you think this would speak to them? Absolutely. He says, but even though you are economically and financially poor and struggling, you're the ones who are rich. You're the ones who are rich because of your faith. He said, don't believe the slander, essentially. I know that you deal with all this slander from the synagogue of Satan. This is not talking about Jews as a whole. It's probably talking about this Jewish contingent that's there. Don't fear what you're going to suffer. Bad things are on the way. You're going to face more tribulation. Just again, warning, warning, warning. Here's what he says: be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Catch that reference? The crown of life. Don't worry about that social caste system, gold crowns, silver crowns, who cares? I'm going to give you the crown that really matters. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Do you see again how culture is just being infused into these letters? Okay, let's keep going down to Pergamum. Pergamum is a little intense, okay? Pergamum is a center for pagan worship, and we're just going to get right at it. I want to tell you what this means. There are worships of two kind of gods in Pergamum that really rise to the surface. One is Caesar himself, right? The emperor himself. The other is a god named Dionysus. And Dionysus is like the party god, okay? Known for celebrations involving wine and lots of sexual immorality. Their festivals. Here's the deal. If you are a woman, you cannot marry by law in Pergamum until you go to a festival of Dionysus and participate in the orgies that happen in that festival. Okay, keep that in mind. When he talks about this is where Satan dwells, you think he might have that in mind? I mean, the level of just idolatry and darkness in Pergamum is ramped up to 11. Let's see. This is going to be the first city to build a whole temple to worship Rome as a whole. We're going to get the Nicolaitans and Balaam called out here. So this is a city, by the way, that has the two-edged sword, that protesti gladi status that can speak on behalf of the emperor with the same level of authority. We're told this is where Satan's throne is. I think just as a mark to how dark this city is, the kind of worship that's happening here is saturated in just deep, deep poverty and moral corruption. This is what Jesus is going to say. I know that you're here in this horrible place, yet you hold fast to my name. You don't deny the faith, even though there are witnesses who are being killed. This is where Satan dwells. But by the way, you got some problems to work on too. There are some here who hold to the teaching of Balaam. And for those of you who know the story of Numbers, Balaam is a figure that's going to pop up in Numbers 22 through Numbers 25. Balaam is a prophet, not a Jewish prophet, just a prophet among the Gentile nations around, who was summoned by a king of Moab to curse the Israelites. He, like 4 chapters, he doesn't do it. He actually ends up speaking prophecies that are favorable toward Israel. It's the weird story about the talking donkey. And then we get to 25. And in 25, Balaam comes up with this bright idea to hurt the Israelites by sending in these Moabite women to seduce them into idolatry. Does that sound kind of familiar with what we're talking about with Dionysus and these festivals? This is what leads to the practice of idolatry. And so Jesus is again drawing this parallel between this prophet that seduced his people into idolatry and this group of people, the Nicolaitans. The Nicolaitans were a group of people, like a sect, you can think of them as, who believed that you could both worship God and fully participate in Roman life. And again, in a city like Pergamum, think about what that means. They think you can worship God and go to the festival of Dionysus, drink wine, eats tons of raw meat, which is also what they did, which is so strange. Like, why raw meat? And participate in these sexual rituals. Can you do both of those things at the same time? Jesus is like, no, no, this is why he hates the Nicolaitans. Remember what he said a few letters ago? He's telling them, repent. You can't do that. He's going to say, I will come to you soon and wage war against them with the sword of my mouth. We'll find out more about this later in the book. And then here we get the final say, he who has an ear to hear, let them hear. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, both of which have ties back to the Old Testament scriptures. By the way, Pergamum is also the site of the largest hospital, which required you to burn incense to the god Asclepius before you ever went in to be healed. So again, if you're a Christian who wants to be healed of some kind of ailment that you have a choice to make. Do you suffer it out, or do you just kind of cross your fingers, burn incense to the god Asclepius, and go in and see the doctor? I say that because, again, this is an example of how wrapped up the worship of gods of Rome and the Greco-Roman Empire are with just everyday life. How are we doing so far?
Great.
Feeling good? Do you see how John is weaving culture and text all at the same time in these letters? They're not just random letters. Every little detail makes sense. Okay, Thyatira. For those of you who are like blue collar working class gents, you're going to love Thyatira. They are known for being a working class city with lots of trade guilds. Every kind of specialty, metalworking, agriculture, I mean, you name it, had its own trade guild. And part of being in that trade guild is the worship of whatever patron god is god of that trade guild. This was a military outpost. It is the smallest of all of the 7 cities. And there is just so happens to be this Jewish prophetess here called Sembanthe, which again, I'm probably butchering how to say that in Jewish or Hebrew. But she is a Jewish prophetess who also dabbles in witchcraft, being an oracle, meaning she's trying to deduce and predict the future. And she worships around this goddess called Sybil. Now, do you think that might pose a little bit of a problem? If you're a Jewish prophetess worshiping God, also dabbling in witchcraft and being an oracle, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Their main export in Thyatira is burnished bronze, which is not bronze, but a special kind of bronze. So with all of that in mind, let's look at this letter. The opening lines, the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze, calling attention to their main export. I know your works, your love and faith and service and endurance, that your latter works exceeded the first. This is a city known for its works, for the works of its hands. Jesus is saying, your latter works exceed the first. I think that's a way of saying your faith, your steadfastness is way more important than these trade guilds, the work that your city is known for. This right here, this message against Jezebel that we're about to dive into is the longest warning or challenge that Jesus is going to offer to the churches. He really is going to go to town on this idea of Jezebel. So they say, you're tolerating that woman Jezebel. And right here, there's 2 layers to this. Jezebel is from the Old Testament. There's a lot of context there. But while he's talking about the Old Testament Jezebel, who we'll talk about here in a second, he's also got in mind this Jewish prophetess Sembanthe that's operating within the city of Thyatira. So who is Jezebel? Her story comes into Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. She is going to marry King Ahab, which if you know your kings, he was not a good one. She is not Israeli. She is from a different nation, and she is going to call people not to worship God. She's going to call people to worship different gods, the god of Baal. She's the one who has all the prophets that remember Elijah, who calls down fire. He wets the altars of all the prophets and says, I'm going to you call your gods, I'll call my God. Jezebel is the one who is the owner of all those priests. They're her priests, basically. She stamps her seal of approval on them. Jezebel is calling Israel to idol worship of other gods. That's what she's known for. And so what Jesus is saying is, you're tolerating this prophetess who's calling you to worship other gods. She's seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality. Now, here's something to keep in mind. I think Walt pointed this out. Almost every time sexual immorality is going to be mentioned in Revelation, it's probably not talking about sex from a moral standpoint. In the Old Testament, sexual immorality is a way of talking about idolatry. This is going to come into play later in Revelation. God is going to introduce this harlot that represents Babylon, and he's going to say, come out of her. Without getting more explicit than that, that is a sexual reference. Come out of her. So in the Hebrew text and here in Revelation, when we worship other gods, there's a sense that that is prostitution on our behalf. Not literal, it's figurative. And so practicing sexual immorality is a figurative way of talking about worshiping other gods. Do you see the connection here?
Mm-hmm.
Come out of her. Don't worship. Don't participate in the prostitution of this harlot Babylon or other gods. Again, eating food sacrificed to idols. Both of these are associated with idol worship. Sometimes that is literal. Worshiping Dionysus, sexual immorality is literally part of the worship ceremony. But I think in most cases, this is a figurative way of talking about idolatry. He's just going to go on a tirade about Jezebel and all the bad things that she's done. This is taken straight from the Old Testament. Jezebel's children died. She would end up dying these horrible deaths. By the way, there's some of you who are prevailing, holding to this teaching. You've learned to call it what it is. And Jesus is going to say, hold fast. Just hang in there. I know it's tough, but hold on. To the one who conquers and keeps my works, not the works of these trade guilds, keeps my works, does my will. Those are the ones who are going to conquer. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The working class city, the guild city. Okay, sorry. Yes.
What was the name of that? The Jewish Jezebel that you mentioned. What was her name again?
Sam Banthe. So Sambathe. Butchered pronunciation by me. Okay. Let's get to Sardis here. We've got 8 minutes. We may be saving chapter 4 for next week. We'll see how we do. Sardis has a really interesting history here. Sardis is going to have 2 different acropolises. Most cities only have one. They have the Acropolis, where all their most famous temples and buildings, public venues, hospitals, gymnasiums, all the centerpieces of the culture and worship are going to be on the Acropolis. But then Sardis also has a necropolis. The necropolis is essentially a graveyard. It's where, like, death, they worship death. Sardis is going to be a city that is fascinated with death and rebirth. It has the 2nd largest gymnasium in all of the Roman Empire. And there's a synagogue attached to that is going to have all these pictures of like Roman worship associated with it. Sardis is also an undefeatable city for thousands of years. So to speak, Sardis remained unconquered until 2 things happened. The legend goes that this conquering army at the foot of the Acropolis was looking up, and they saw a helmet from one of the guards who had fallen asleep fall down the hill. And then they noticed that this soldier appeared on the mountain, picked up his helmet, walked back in, and then went back up to the side. And so if you're a conquering city looking for a way in, what your ears are perked up a little bit. So sure enough, they send a little scouting party up the hill and they find a secret entrance into Sardis. And they go in at night, and in 1 hour, this impenetrable city falls to this invading army, all because this one soldier fell asleep. And if that's not bad enough, years and years later, I think it's like 50 some years later, it happens again, where again, they notice this, you'll have to listen to Bema to hear the full story, but they notice that there's crows on the top of the mountain on the city wall. And that means that there's no one guarding that part of the city. So they go up there to scout. And again, they find the secret entrance and are able to go in and conquer the city of Sardis. Now, I mean, that's pretty shameful, right? You think they would have learned their lesson the first time, but they did not. Sardis has a fascination with death and the afterlife. Let's see, is there anything else I want to mention before we, oh yes. Sardis is known for a particular ceremony that's pretty brutal. The goddess of Sybil, the way that she is worshipped is by voluntary castration. So once a year, they would have, I know, y'all, I know, you're giving me looks. I didn't make this up, okay? I didn't participate in it. Every year, all of the inhabitants of the city who want to participate would don white robes, and they would sing and chant and drink, get themselves really drunk, because how else are you going to do this? Get themselves really drunk and approach the temple of Sybil. And there's this big stone table at the front of the entrance. And anyone who was really zealous would do the deed. They would castrate themselves as a show of ultimate loyalty to this goddess. Now, not everyone did it, but if you just so happen to be close enough where some of the blood from these other, zealous worshipers got on you, then it's like you did it yourself. If their blood touches you, it's like you participated in the ceremony, even though you didn't go through with the act of castration. Does this make sense? It's just awful. So with all of that in mind, let's look at what Jesus says to the city of Sardis. I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. They have a fascination with death. He says, wake up. Don't get caught sleeping on the city walls and therefore find yourself defeated. Strengthen what remains and is about to die. For I have not found your works complete in the sight of God. Remember then, I will come like a thief in the night. See the reference? Going to come like those conquering soldiers who managed to find an entryway in the night. You won't know which hour I will have come. Yet you still have a few names in Sardis. This is the positive traits. People who have not soiled their garments. Do you catch what he's talking about here? You've not participated in the Sybil worship. They're going to walk with me in white, the true white robes. I will make them pure. The one who conquers will thus be clothed in white garments. I will never blot out his name from the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and the angels. Let him who has an ear to hear. Do you see the message? There's archaeological evidence that in the city of Sardis, by this Sybil temple, there was another little building. It's got like red stonework to it. And what they believe is that this was a Christian building. It wasn't a church or a place of worship. It was a hospital. Right on the edge of this temple, where people would come and castrate themselves to a goddess, the Christians in that community propped up a little hospital to be able to care for the people who are worshiping Sybil. That is what Jesus has in mind here. People who have not soiled their garments, but who are taking care of the ones who are. This is the kind of community that is built up in Sardis. Is that not a beautiful picture of what the church is supposed to be? I think that's fascinating. Okay, we have two more. We're going to get through these pretty quick. If you have to go, it's okay if you're getting a tight timeline at 8 o'clock. this is recorded so you can watch the rest of this later. But let's get through Philadelphia and then my favorite, Laodicea. To the angel of the church of Philadelphia. Okay, here's the context of Philadelphia. If you remember, when we look at this picture of where the 7 churches are, Philadelphia is the one that has this little road that goes off into Asia proper. So Philadelphia is known, therefore, as the door to Asia Minor, because those coming in from Asia will first step foot in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the door to Asia Minor. Philadelphia is plagued by earthquakes. Their main export was wine for a really long time. They were known for their good wine. When Rome was going through a grain shortage, they ripped up 75% of the vineyards in Philadelphia and replanted grain. Didn't do very well. They knew it wasn't going to do very well, but Rome was desperate, for reasons we'll find out next week, to produce some kind of grain. At any given time, Rome only had enough food for 2 days. They were always on the brink of famine. They did not have enough grain to feed their empire. Philadelphia, therefore, hated the Caesar. They really hated the Flavian dynasty, of which Domitian is a part of, because it just destroyed one of their main exports. In fact, Philadelphia was destroyed, given a new name after the Flavian Empire, and they hated it. No one referred to them as that name. And so they were renamed again back to Philadelphia. They went through several different name changes. The empire helped them rebuild on 2 separate occasions after major earthquakes that took place in this city. Okay, here we see the words that Jesus has to say to the city with all of that in our minds. To the true one, the Holy One, who has the key of David, who opens the doors, no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. Context, that door to Asia Minor. He says, I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. In other words, there is no one who's going to be kept out of Jesus's community. He's going to again refer to the synagogue of Satan, probably evidence that again here there is a community of Jewish people who are not wanting to recognize the Gentiles or welcome them into the church, which again, in Jesus's community, that's just not what happens. He has the door that no one can shut. Everyone is allowed in. He tells them, I'm coming soon. 7 times in Revelation, we're going to hear Jesus say these words, I am coming soon. He says, hold fast to what you have so that no one may seize your crown. To the one who conquers, listen to this, a city plagued by earthquakes, I will make him a pillar, steadfast, unable to be shaken, in the temple of my God. This is, Revelation was written in the 90s AD, at least 20 years after the temple was destroyed. So what do you think he's talking about here? Who are the real temple at this time in the church? It's the people. Yeah, it's the people. So what he's saying here is, I'm going to make you a pillar in the church, in the true temple, the way that you experience God, which is the community of Jesus. I will write on him the name of God. Listen to the emphasis on name. The name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down from God out of heaven, and my own new name. To a city that's gone through several name changes. What does this say to you? The only identity that you need to cling to is the identity that Jesus gives you. Make sense? Okay, we're burning through that one fast because we've got to have time for Laodicea. This is my favorite one. It's probably the most famous. Have you ever heard a teaching about being called a lukewarm? Don't be lukewarm. Don't be a lukewarm Christian. Okay, forget all of that. Forget all of it. Here's the context of Laodicea. It has a big problem. To the north of Laodicea is this just paradise, Hierapolis, wealthy tourist center, known for its hot springs, healing waters. People come from all over to experience the warm waters, rich with minerals and healing properties in Hierapolis. All three of these cities, along with Philadelphia, are plagued by earthquakes. All three of them have been destroyed at one point or another. Hierapolis always gets money for a bailout from Rome, and they take it. They love it. Give us the money. We're going to rebuild our tourist centers so that more and more people come to experience our healing warm waters. Laodicea also is offered money to rebuild, but you know what they say? We'll do it ourselves. And you can take that as a slight against Rome, but probably more likely it's, don't worry, Caesar, we can do this. You don't need to spend your money on this. We've got it. We'll do it ourselves. Colossae, unfortunately, other than being known for their cool springs and refreshing cold water, is not really known for much else. There's still not a lot of archaeological work that's being done in Colossae. They're kind of like the middle child, the forgotten city. They never get money to rebuild. Rome doesn't even offer it to them. They give all the money to Hierapolis and some of these other cities. Colossae is like kind of forgotten about. So to the north, you have these warm waters in the warm springs that are useful for healing properties. To the south, you have Colossae, known for its cool springs, refreshing water. Laodicea has a problem. By the time the hot water gets to Laodicea, it flows south, it's no longer hot. And the mineral properties that were present in the water makes it so not only is it sorry, I'm gonna mute a few people. Sorry, y'all. Not only is it no longer hot, the minerals make it kind of nasty tasting. So it's like, ugh, gross. Colossae, when they try and pump water north from the cool, refreshing springs, it doesn't stay cool as it makes the journey. And so throughout its history, Laodicea is known as a city with awful water. The pipes constantly burst because they fill with mineral deposits. They just can't. Now I think they've probably, in modern day, they've probably got it figured out. But for the longest time, Laodicea had really bad water. At the same time, they're still a very wealthy center. This is the one who's known for its eye salves. Their healing salves that they were able to produce on the eyes using the rich minerals from their neighbors in the north, Hierapolis. Okay, with all of that context, look at what Jesus says. I know your works. You're neither hot or cold. Would that you were either hot or cold. Instead, you're lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, so I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Now, he's not saying be all in or be out. What is he saying? Be useful. Hot water has the healing properties. Cold water is refreshing. Lukewarm water is good for nothing. So whatever you do, be useful, serve a purpose. I'm going to spit you, your yucky water. I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Does this make sense? Be useful. This is not about, I'd rather you be like all out or all in. This is not talking about your level of commitment to Jesus. This is talking about your usefulness. In other words, following Jesus is not only about what you believe. We've talked about this in Ephesians. There is a component that is about what your works, what you're doing. Not that we're saved by our works, but there is a usefulness that he demands of them. He's going to talk about the salve that they're famous for to anoint their eyes. I'm going to give you the salve so that you will actually be able to see. Forget the stuff that you're known for. I can give you the true sight. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. What does that imply? If you're standing at the door and knocking, where are you? You're on the outside. You're not in. They've shut Jesus out to some extent. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. And again, to the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne. He who has an ear to hear, let them hear. How do we feel about Laodicea? Everybody's muted now because I've made such a big deal out of it. Do these make sense? Do we see how the seven churches these letters are working?
Yes.
Questions,
Yes.
comments?
Yes.
What do we think about all this?
I have one question.
Yes,
What's the second death?
second death. Let's go.
In Smyrna, he talks about it in Smyrna.
Smyrna, the second death. The first death, I think, is the death of the body. The second death is the death of I don't want to say the word soul, but like a spiritual death. So everybody in Smyrna was obsessed with death. They're obsessed with the death of the body. What you need to be obsessed with is the death that is final.
So the spirit
Yeah.
after the death, the physical death.
Yeah. The death that really matters is not the death of our physical body. It's the spiritual death that we experience.
Is the second death referred to elsewhere in the Bible?
Let's find out. Here's a good practice, especially in Revelation. I have done this so many times this week. If ever you want to know if a phrase is used, go to Bible Gateway and just type it in and see what pops up. So it's only ever mentioned, at least in this capacity, in Revelation. It's written 4 times here in the beginning, and then it's going to show up in chapters 20 and 21. Over such the second death has no power. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. That goes right into what we're talking about, Bill. Second death, where death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. The death of judgment, the ultimate death. This is a great tool. In Revelation, if you think that phrase sounds so strange, put it in Bible Gateway. See where else it's talked about in the Bible. Very helpful tool. What else? Thoughts?
Alex, I had a question about the letter that we started talking about at the very beginning, the letter from Pliny or whatever the person's name was.
Oh, yes.
What year? Did you tell us what year that was? Does that track with when we think Revelation was written?
It's I clicked off of it. 111 to 113 AD, so just after.
Okay.
Around the same time, I mean, almost the same time period. What else? How are we feeling about Revelation so far?
Thank goodness you've given us these keys. I have a quick question. What was the name of the tree in the middle of the Artemis temple?
A tree of asylum.
Asylum. Thank you.
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see all your faces. What else? How are we feeling about that? Do you see how John, most important thing, do you see how John is weaving at the same time 2 different layers of culture and text? We did a lot of culture work today. The text work really comes into play in chapters 4 and 5, but he is weaving these 2 things together, Old Testament imagery and stories with the cultural context unique to this time period and these individual cities themselves. It's masterfully done.
And now he makes the description of Jesus each time associated with that as well.
Yeah, with that particular city. Absolutely. He's speaking to these individual contexts. We are going to save, because of time, chapter 4 and 5 for next week. 4 you'll read on Friday. What I would tell you is it's probably good we're doing that, because these 2 are meant to be together. They're a pair. Chapter 4 is going to talk about God. Chapter 5 is going to talk all about Jesus. They're 2 sides again of the same coin. And we split them up on 2 weeks. I'm so sorry. We feeling okay? All right. Well, that's it for tonight. Chapter 4 is my favorites. We'll start there when we get to next week. And then we'll just keep on going. We're moving fast and furious. So raise your hand if you have questions. Don't be afraid to send me an email. And I would love to figure, if I don't know the answer, I will try and figure it out before I wave the white flag. Will someone be willing to say a prayer to close out our time together? You know I'll call on you.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
Oh, Heavenly Father, we just thank you for Alex is just willing to take this time and do all this. We know she does so much background work, her and Elizabeth, Lord, and Hannah and Matt do too, Lord. So I just thank you for all of this. We thank you for your word. It never comes back void, Lord. We just thank you that you are speaking to us as well through these churches, Lord, that we know we have same kind of issues here, Lord. And I just pray you continue to reveal yourself to us, Lord, through this study of Revelation, Lord, and just bring us back all together next week through your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Be thinking
Amen.
this week, which of these 7 churches do you identify with? Which one kind of strikes a
Oh,
chord with
it's a
you?
good one.
You know, let that be just something that lingers with you as you read throughout the rest of the week. All right, we'll see you back here next Wednesday, starting with chapter
Thank
4.
you.
Thanks,
Have a
Alex.
great night.
Thanks a bunch.